happened, I handled it bravely, pretty much, except I was brave. I just had a problem with my conscience that I couldn't resolve. You might say, well, if you were so brave, why didn't you just go off and marry him? It wasn't that I didn't have the courage. Well, maybe I was scared, but it wasn't that I was scared of Brent. I was scared of God. I was afraid God would kill me. You have to understand my background. I devoted my life to God. I was willing to go to the mission field. There were times when I was in my 20s that I asked God to kill me if I would sin against him. If I asked God to kill me so that my mother and would be saved. That's what kind of a Christian I was. So, coming from a background like that, I was a very devout Christian, totally dedicated to God. When I sacrificed and went to the Christian university and turned down an opportunity to become an Air Force officer, I didn't have any money. I went by faith. And I was afraid that I'd end up starving to death at that school. I did have one day where I only had a drumstick because I didn't have any money for food, but God took care of me. I learned to take it one day at a time. But I wasn't sure if I'd live from one day to the next. I remember when I was on it was a Delta Airlines flight from Miami to Atlanta, and I had packed my bags that night. When I was kind of scared of that plane. I thought, am I crazy? I turned down a chance to be an Air Force officer. I go against my family. I only have about $30 in my purse. I don't even have money for tuition at this school. And God tells me to get on this plane and go up and trust him. So I went. And I was a little scared. I thought maybe I was nuts or something. But I had no doubt that God spoke to me. See, you got to understand that I'm a Christian that came from a background like that. And then I was hit with the temptation of my life. And I knew God was real. Because I had experience in prayer with God. I saw him miraculously answer prayer for me when I went to that Christian university. I knew he was real, and I feared him. And coming from a background like that, it wasn't easy for me to sin with Brent Spiner. And yet I loved him, and I didn't think that was a sin. So it was like a delicate balancing act for me. I wanted to love him, and I felt like he needed my encouragement. But yet at the same time, I didn't want the love to tread over into the sin territory. I wanted to make sure I kept my power in prayer. Because that's something I always had and that I treasured. And I didn't want to lose it. And there's one more thing I'd like to say. And that is, you might say, why did you keep it secret from everybody? Why didn't you tell your mother or your sister? I opened up a little bit to my sister, but I didn't tell her too much. I really didn't tell anybody. I opened up a little bit to Leslie Jacobs. And I was very, very good about keeping my mouth shut. I had a very strong motivation for doing this. I was in love with Brent. And I was afraid that if people knew that he had called me and said he wanted to rape me on the phone and that he would get in trouble. And I could tell that he was too big a man and too great a person, that he wouldn't deserve the unfair criticism that he would get. Because I knew Americans had a lot of sexual hang-ups, so I viciously tried to protect him. That's why I kept my mouth shut, and I never told anybody the whole truth about how extensive Brent and I were communicating, or how much I was communicating with him. My motive for keeping quiet was to protect him, because I loved him. I loved him enough to die for him. And I kept my mouth shut because I knew that if word got out, that it would not be good for him. Because I was a married woman. It just didn't look good. I saw something in him that I knew the rest of the world wouldn't see, except his close friends who know him. So that's why I didn't tell anybody. It wasn't that I was ashamed of him. I was afraid that he would be hurt, that he would be misunderstood, and I could tell that there was something big and great about him, something very courageous and generous, and I viciously protected him. I sensed something really great about that man. And I knew he was the type of person, he was the type of man who would be willing to risk misunderstanding to be great in secret and to take public scorn. I could tell he was like that. And I thought that was precious, that he had that attitude. It was so opposite my husband, who wanted everybody to think he was great, but in private he stunk. Whereas Brent was just the opposite. In public, he didn't seem to care what kind of impression he made, but in private, he was great. He never, ever treated me with the slightest hint of disrespect. In all of his dealings with me, he was the utmost in sensitivity, and always very kind and tender, and extremely generous. And I felt a man like that deserved my vicious protection, and that's what he got. I've always had a kind of an independent streak, whereas I try to base my morals on I've always feared God more than I fear men. And I make my moral decisions based on that. And I'm willing to risk misunderstanding to do what I feel is loving, generous, kind, and courageous, even if it means I have to risk public censure. And I made the choice that I was going to stand behind Brent Spiner, even if it meant my reputation went down the drain. Because I wasn't concerned about my reputation. I was more concerned about my character, about who I really was. And it got me into some trouble. But I knew that Brent was not a bad person. But I knew that the actions and the risks that he took with me, where he made himself emotionally vulnerable, that if I was a bad woman, I could have ruined him. But I had too much love in my heart. And maybe I had enough greatness in me that I could not betray somebody that I thought was great. And I didn't judge him to be great because of the fact that he was famous or because he was a big star. I saw some inner qualities of generosity, of courage, of a willingness to sacrifice, a humanitarian heart. And I realized that he was often misunderstood by the public because he often did what he felt was right, even if it meant being scorned and misunderstood. I respected him for that. That's why I stuck by him so viciously. I knew that my friends, my Christian friends, would think that I stood by him because I was enamored with his fame and his fortune. But in my heart, I knew that God knew my heart, and that God understood that it wasn't his fame and his fortune I was in love with. Many times I went to God in prayer and I said, God, one of the biggest reasons I haven't gone to this man is because he is famous. And if I marry him, it's going to make you look bad. Everybody's going to think I dumped my poor husband for this rich celebrity. I said, I love this man because of who he is, because of his generosity, his courage, his compassion, his humanitarian heart. I said, I sense greatness in him. And it just aggravates me that because he's famous, because he's rich, that I know if I go to him it would bring disgrace to your name, and I claim to be a Christian. And I said, I wish you would make a way for me to go to him so I wouldn't have to